everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of my True Story podcast. I'm your host, Catherine. Now, in my last and first episode, we were in Cheshire, Connecticut. Today, we are going to be traveling down to Newtown, Connecticut. Now, Newtown, Connecticut is a small town located in Fairfield County in southwestern Connecticut. It's about 60 miles from New York City. Newtown is bordered on the south by Easton and Reading, and the north by Bridgewater and Southbury, on the east by Oxford and Monroe, and on the west by Bethel and Brookfield. So Newtown is traversed by Interstate 84. It's near Route 6 and 302. So just to give you kind of a little background of where Newtown is, if you know Connecticut, you can just pull up a map and you want to look at it too. You might have heard of Newtown in 2012 when, unfortunately, there was that mass shooting in Sandy Hook, but we are not going to be talking about that right now. Today, we are going to be talking about the murder of Helle Crafts. This episode is going to be called the Woodchipper murder. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard this story before, but I did want to just dig a little bit deeper and go into some of the more details from what happened, because I knew about this case, but I didn't really know everything that went into it, and it was actually really, I don't want to say interesting, but it was pretty interesting to find out how the husband was caught. So without further ado, we are going to be talking about the Woodchipper murder. This takes place November 18th, 1986 in Newtown, Connecticut. Helle Crafts came home from her flight attendant job, and she was really excited for the upcoming Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, the next morning, her friends and family lose track of her. They can't find her. They become very worried because she's not the type of person to just up and disappear and not tell anybody where she's going. The only person who wasn't too worried was her husband, Richard Crafts. So just a little background on Helle Lork Nielsen. She was born July 7th, 1947 in Denmark. She was a kind, intelligent woman with dreams to travel the world. Helle attended college in England and then went on to become an au pair in France temporarily. Au pair is basically a nanny. After that, she accepted a flight attendant position at Capital Airways. She did end up at Pan American Airways, Pan Am, and was an asset to the company because she was bilingual, so that was a really big help for them. Helle relocated to Miami, which is common for people working at Pan Am. They would stay in local hotels near the airport in between flights. In 1967, when Helle was just 22 years old, she met Richard Kraft at an airline convention. He was 31 and a pilot working for Eastern Airlines. Richard was engaged, but him and Helle hit it off right away. After that, they became dating. Helle didn't think it was too serious, so she didn't really think about the engagement that Richard was in. She just assumed that they were hanging out as friends. Helle's friends didn't know what she saw in Richard. He was standoffish, had a bad temper, and he would pick fights with Helle for no reason. Helle was still interested in Richard despite all of this, and despite her friends telling her their opinions. Helle and Richard dated on and off for about 6 years until 1975. Helle was pregnant with her first child, so they decided to get married. I'm not really sure what happened to Richard's fiancée. I couldn't really find anything about that. So the couple got married and moved to Newtown, Connecticut, into a very nice neighborhood so that they can start the big family that they've been dreaming of. Helle gave birth to 3 children, Andrew, Christina, and Thomas. The children were the light of Helle's life. She loved being a mother and prioritized it and was very involved in her children's lives. She was involved in the PTA, she went to sports functions, extracurricular activities, and she just absolutely adored all of her children. Helle and Richard still worked for the airlines, so they both traveled a lot. At the time, they hired a 19-year-old live-in nanny, Dawn Marie Thomas. Richard was gone more often with his pilot job, and he also had 2 other jobs on the side. He worked as an auxiliary police officer in Newtown, and then he was also a part-time policeman in Southbury, Connecticut. The Crafts family was well known and liked in their community. Helle was also very liked by everyone who knew her. Unfortunately, the couple's relationship was strained. Richard was cold and physically abusive toward Helle. The family was very well off, but Richard was stingy with his money. He spent how much he wanted on whatever he wanted. He did not let Helle do the same. Richard made Helle use her lower salary to support herself, the kids, and the bills. He also made her budget her money. It didn't seem to bother Helle, but Helle hated that Richard was gone a lot. Sometimes he would leave for days with no communication on when he'd be back. Helle kept composure for the sake of her children. In 1985, Helle suspected Richard was having an affair. She noticed a number on their phone bill that she didn't recognize. She soon found out it was a woman in New Jersey who Richard was calling very regularly. Helle didn't say anything to Richard. She just ended up tracking his phone records and conversations. But in 1986, she ended up hiring a divorce attorney, Diane Anderson. Helle told Diane that she suspected that her husband was having an affair. Helle hired a PI to confirm her decision. Diane recommended Keith Mayo, a former police officer. So Helle hired Mayo to document and to follow Richard to get evidence of the affair. It didn't take long because Mayo got surveillance photos of Richard and another woman holding hands and kissing. He put them in a neat little package and was going to send it off to Helle. They met up a few days later to go over what Mayo found. Helle was devastated when she found out, even though she had her suspicion. But everything she'd known for the last 12 years was basically over. Helle told her friends and mom what she discovered, how she was feeling, and how scared she was. Helle's friend Lena Johnson remembers a convo that they had in the fall of 1986. Helle said to her, "If anything happens to me, don't assume it was an accident." And that is a quote. Helle served Richard with divorce papers, but Richard refused or even acknowledged the divorce and what was happening. He didn't look at or sign the papers. He continued to act like everything was fine. Eventually, Richard made an appointment with the local police to go over the papers and then to sign them, but he never made it to the appointment. Richard claims that he was scared that if they got a divorce, he wouldn't be able to see his kids. Helle then asked Richard if they can sit down civilly and talk about terms of the divorce. They planned to talk when Helle came home from her flight assignment in Germany. Helle came home from Germany late in the evening, November 18th, 1986. Her coworker dropped her off at her house, and Helle kept saying how excited she was for Thanksgiving, seeing her family, and just being together. Unfortunately, after her coworker dropped her off, Helle was never seen again. And just a side note, I can't even imagine being that coworker who dropped her off at home only to never hear from or see her again. I can't even imagine. So on the night that she came home, there was a huge snowstorm. It was so bad that most of Newtown lost power. At 6 a.m., Richard woke the nanny and asked her if she can help him get him and the kids ready to go to his sister's house because they didn't have any power. So he figured, let me bring the kids to my sister's with the nanny. They can hang out there and stay warm while I kind of deal with things at home. Dawn, the nanny, asked Richard where Helle was, and he said that she left for work. So Richard dropped Dawn and the kids off at Westport at his sister's where they, again, had power. At 7 p.m., Richard picked Dawn and the kids up because they had power again, so he brought them home back to Newtown. Dawn again asked Richard, where was Helle? Richard told Dawn he didn't know. Dawn thought that was kind of weird, but she wasn't questioning it. Until when she went home, she noticed a dark stain on the master bedroom carpet. So days went on. And a few days later, Richard started removing pieces of the rug in the bedroom, including the part with the stain. Dawn did ask Richard about the stain. Richard said that he spilled kerosene while trying to light a lamp when the power was out. Dawn didn't ask any more questions, but also did not forget what she saw. Then Helle missed her next flight assignment, which was very out of character for her. So her coworker reached out to Richard. Her coworker's name was Trudy, and her and Helle were very good friends at the workplace. Richard told Trudy that Helle went to Denmark to take care of her mother who had become ill, and she would be back in a few days. Trudy was hesitant to believe that because why wouldn't Helle call her work and just tell them where she was going? It was, again, out of character for her to do that. It just wasn't what Helle was normally doing. If she had something to do, she would tell her friends, she would tell her coworkers, she would tell her boss, hey, this is what's going on, but nobody heard anything from her. Trudy actually saw Helle's car parked in the Pan Am parking lot and kept an eye on it for when Helle returned home from, quote-unquote, Denmark. The car remained untouched in the lot for several days. Helle's friends started getting worried. Her friends started to compare stories, and they realized that Richard was telling her friends different stories. He was telling one of them that she was in Denmark with her ill mother. She told another one that she was in the Canary Islands with friends, and then he also told people, Richard also was telling Helle's friends that he just didn't know where she was. He was blatantly saying, I don't know. Helle's friends decided to reach out to her divorce attorney, Diane, to see if she knew something that they didn't. When Diane found out that Helle was missing, she reached out to the PI, Keith Mayo. Keith knew Richard was physically abusive, so he immediately feared the worst. He went to the Newtown Police Department and filed a missing person report and stressed how concerned he was. The police didn't think Richard would hurt Helle. They thought that Keith was overreacting. They worked with Richard for years. They knew who he was. They knew the type of person he was, and they were friends. They didn't even start an investigation on Helle's whereabouts because they trusted Richard so much. Now, we've heard this happen before where people in the force don't start investigations because of personal interference. They all thought that Richard was such a great guy because he worked with them and he was a police officer himself, so they didn't think anything of it. Thankfully, Keith started his own investigation to see what happened to Helle. He started by talking to Dawn, the family nanny, as she was with this family almost 24/7. She lived with them. Dawn did not hold back. She told Keith everything she knew, even about the stain on the carpet and how it was now gone because Richard tore apart the carpet and brought it to the dump. She also mentioned that there was a large freezer that the family owned that suddenly disappeared. After Keith heard about the stained carpet, he immediately got a group together to find it. They went to the dump and looked through piece by piece for days to find that carpet. They did end up finding pieces of that carpet and what they thought was blood. They brought the carpet to Dr. Henry Lee at the Connecticut Crime Lab. The stains were actually not blood. Small town did end up finding out about Helle's disappearance, so news stations ran with it. It became so popular that people from Newtown were pressuring the PD to find more answers about what happened to Helle. They find out that this woman is missing and that there's not even a police investigation going on, so of course they're going to be worried. On December 2nd, 1986, the Major Crimes Unit interviewed Richard 3 weeks after Helle disappeared. It was noted that Richard was very standoffish when talking about Helle, their marriage, the divorce, his affair. They asked about the carpet, and he just said it was easier to do it in pieces than all at once to get rid of it. He said that he was embarrassed that he didn't know where his wife was, which is why he told different stories to different people. They asked Richard to give a written statement on the last interaction he had with Helle. The statement was short and vague. It was about a paragraph or two long. After he gave the short, non-detailed statement, he just went home. Now, because of how he acted in the interview, they actually started to look more into him as a person of interest. They found very interesting credit card purchases, like a new set of bedding after Helle disappeared, a new freezer, and a large woodchipper. It was found out that if the divorce was finalized, Helle would receive half of Richard's assets and pension. On December 26, 1986, a warrant was issued for a search of the house. Richard and the kids were in Florida for the holidays, so they were able to just go right over. The house was almost completely empty, and the furniture looked like it was just dropped down and never touched again. There were piles of dirty clothes, dishes, and all the carpets were removed. They did find some of the carpet from the master bedroom, and they also found blood on the mattress. It was discovered that the blood was type O positive blood, and Helle had type O positive blood, so that was definitely something to be looked at. The investigators also found clean towels in the bathroom, so they were sprayed with lumenthol, and it was determined that they were previously completely soaked in blood. They also didn't find the freezer that Richard purchased at the time of Helle's disappearance. When Richard got home to Connecticut, he took a polygraph test and passed. The police were still pretty sure that Richard was responsible for Helle's disappearance, though, after all that they found. But unfortunately, with no body, they couldn't determine that Richard actually did murder her. That was until January 1987, where there was a break in the case. Joseph Hine came forward with some very crucial information. Joseph was an employee for the city of Southbury. He remembered clearly the snowstorm that happened the night that Helle disappeared. He was out all night plowing the roads, and he noticed that they were completely deserted. Until around 3:30 a.m., he saw a truck parked on River Road near Lake Zor. There was a U-Haul truck with a woodchipper attached to the back. He didn't really think anything of it, but it was still there when he drove by 2 hours later. This time, he got closer to see what was going on. He saw a man in an orange parka tossing wood into the woodchipper, and he was facing the woodchipper to the river so that the chippings would go into the water. That's all he saw until the man in the parka kind of waved for him to go around him, like, it's okay, you can go around me. But he couldn't shake the feeling of something being kind of off about this. There was a man with a wood chipper at 3:30 in the morning, like, kind of bizarre. So the police department asked Joseph to bring them to where he saw this happen. When they got there, they saw a pile of wood chippings on the ground. But it wasn't just wood. It was green plastic, pieces of paper, and full envelopes that didn't get shredded. And the envelopes were addressed to none other than Helle Crafts. The area was marked off, and investigators went through every piece of debris. It was mostly fragments, but they found more pieces of envelopes addressed to Helle. Every single thing that they found was sent to the crime lab for analysis. What was found, I'm going to make a list here. What was found in this pile of debris was as follows: 2,600 blonde human hairs, 3 ounces of human tissue, 69 fragments of human bone, a piece of a human skull, a piece of a human finger, a painted fingernail, a piece of a toenail, and 2 teeth. Then the investigators searched the river 1 mile in each direction, but because of the temperature of the water, the divers could only go in for short periods at a time. What they did find was a chainsaw with the serial number filed off. That was taken to the crime lab, which they found more blonde hair and more human tissue, and then blue fibers from a bedroom carpet. They ended up finding the serial number on the chainsaw, and it matched warranty papers signed by Richard Crafts. So investigators kind of came up with a story of what they believe happened that night. They believe that early morning, November 19th, 1986, Richard Crafts bludgeoned Helle Crafts with a flashlight. This was while their children were asleep down the hall. Her head hit the mattress when she fell, which is where the blood came from that the investigators found. It streamed onto the carpet. He ended up wrapping Helle in the sheets and brought her to the large capacity freezer. Richard cleaned the bedroom as best as he could, woke the children and Dawn up in the morning, got them out of the house so that he can dispose of Helle's body. He took her from the freezer, took her somewhere to dismember her, nobody's quite sure where, put her in green trash bags, and put her back in the freezer. He then took the truck, Helle's body, and the woodchipper to River Road. He then put his wife through the woodchipper, and because she was frozen, it wasn't as messy as you would think because her body was frozen. I mean, I'm sure it was as gruesome and as messy as it could possibly be, but again, because she was frozen, it wasn't as bloody as it probably would have been if she wasn't coming from the freezer. This is when he was seen by Joseph Hine. After Joseph drove away, Richard threw the chainsaw into the river, but to this day, the freezer still has not been found. On January 11th, 1987, the police arrested Richard Crafts at his home. They called him and told him to come outside with his hands up, so he decided to say, and I quote, "I'm tired. I'll take care of it in the morning," unquote. The police then called him again, asking for him to surrender, and he said, and I quote, "Don't call me again," unquote, and then hung up. It took them 3 hours to get him out of the house while his kids were asleep. His kids were asleep while they were surrounded the house with guns and calling him multiple times to have him come out to surrender. Finally, at 1 a.m., he was taken into custody. Richard was charged with Helle's murder and a $750,000 bond while awaiting his trial. The trial began in May of 1988. So the most important piece of evidence was a tooth that they found at the river. The tooth was a perfect match to Helle after they looked at the dental records. So actually, it was a very weird story of how the tooth came to be found. An investigator fell by the river, and he slid down a bank, and the tooth was stuck to his hand. So if he never fell, who knows if they would have actually found this tooth and matched it with Helle. So now with the tooth, bone, tissues, fibers, there was a pretty decent argument. Helle Crafts was dead and was disposed of by the river. The trial lasted 53 days and it ended June 23rd. The jury deliberated for 2 weeks and came to an 11-1 split, so it ended in a mistrial. The one juror actually stormed out of the courthouse and never came back, so that's probably the one person that thought that he was innocent. They ended up trying him again in Norwalk, Connecticut. That lasted 2 months and ended November 20th, 1989, just a few days after the 3-year anniversary of Helle's death. The jury deliberated for 8 hours and found Richard guilty. Richard's sister had custody of his kids, and at the sentencing, in January 1990, she begged the judge to give him the maximum sentence possible. So he was sentenced to 50 years in state prison. He said he was innocent and appealed in 1993, which was denied, but he always maintained his innocence. Richard was released because of good behavior November of 2019. Only 32 of the 50 years he was supposed to serve. There was a law that said that inmates who have good behavior can be let out early. Thank goodness that law has now been changed. But as of 2019, Richard Crafts was a free, quote-unquote, free man. And actually, the pension from the airline was dispersed to all 3 of the kids, and the community raised $200,000 to help Richard's sister raise the children, which is just beautiful, because that's obviously something that she wasn't planning on doing, and then her brother decided to murder his wife and the mother of his children, so... But that is the end of the absolutely tragic and brutal murder of Helle Crafts. She did absolutely nothing to deserve any of this, as most people who are murdered are. But Richard just was scared of getting a divorce, so decided to do the worst humanly possible thing to his wife and mother of his children. I just can't even believe that. So that is what I have for you today. I promise episodes are going to be longer in the future. I'm just, again, still working this whole thing out. I still have to figure out how to edit all of this. It takes me a little while, but I appreciate you guys being here. And tell your friends, because I would really like to make this a thing that I can do more often than not. So, and also leave me some cases that I can work at. Again, I'm still working on them in Connecticut. So if you know of any paranormal or true crime stories in Connecticut, just let me know. And I would love to look up some information about that. And if you have any information about it too, give me some info that you have. But thank you so much for listening. Follow me on my personal TikTok. I will leave all of that in the description. Follow me on Instagram, and I think that's all I have. And then obviously follow my podcast on Spotify. I will talk to you guys later.